In this second part to the Creating an Album series, I'll be looking at the new track I just released, which is called One Last Chance. This track is similar in terms of instrumentation to the previous track because it's continuing with the momentum from the last one, meaning it's got brass stabs and staccatos from strings and things like that, so we won't dive too far into that aspect of this track. I'll be looking at more the difference in time signatures, the tempo, and how I actually struggled to try and make this track, as well as the amount of ideas I had to go through to actually make it flow from one section to another. So let's get into it. So as you can see, I've got brass stabs, sustained strings, and a talking drum, which is different from the previous track, starting off the track. So if I play it now, so as you can hear, that introduction section starts off with minimal brass stabs and no low stabs. This was due to the first section becoming slightly boring, a bit samey when trying to get into the next section. And as you could hear, as you can hear at the second part of this introduction section, the low brass comes in and a drum roll comes in. It sounds a bit fuller and sounds a lot better than having that going twice. The main difference in this introduction, and I haven't used in any track before, is the talking drum, which is a contact instrument. As you can see, very sort of simplistic, fairly simple sounds. It does also come with a few of its own rhythms, but I was able to manipulate the MIDI that I played in quite well to create this momentum, make it double the speed kind of thing. So if I click on it now, you can see fairly simple pattern, but what I basically had beforehand was this. So as you can hear, it's dum 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 dum, which sounds great. I really needed to keep momentum. Like the latest Mission Impossible film, they use a lot of talking drums, as well as Black Panther. I think that was when it started to be used quite primarily in tracks. So I really wanted to sort of replicate that feeling, and I couldn't quite do it just by playing it in on the MIDI keyboard. So what I did, as you can see here, is I took these and I just dragged it across, and immediately it just sounded so much better. And you can see that I actually muted that last note because it just feels slightly out of place. But that whole run just, as you can hear, just creates a lot of momentum within the track itself. Another instrument that we have, which wasn't used in the last track, is a brass trill, I believe it may be called. I have its own name, a flutter crescendo. Very cool sound, adds a nice transition into sections and things. It's very raw power in there, and as you can see, I've put it into bus 1 like the last track, direction mixer, spread 2, so that it feels slightly fuller. So that goes from a slightly drum heavy introduction to being a bit more full into the second part of that introduction, and then that brings us into the next section. And this is where the track changes from the last one quite a lot, because I changed the time signature. There was a really cool rhythm that I was trying out, and I'd stuck with 5/4 originally. I was thinking Mission Impossible 5/4. I did a 7/8 previously. I'll stick with another sort of slightly different time signature. But then I did this rhythm, and I was like, oh, that sounds great. But it's not 5/4. It was 4/4. But it transitions quite nicely, and then I go back to 5/4 nearer the end. So if I play the section now. That section continues the momentum from the start, and what I introduce is more drums. Take out the talking drums for now, but I include a kick, an orchestral kick, and some toms. Now I'll play those two, I'll play them separately and then I'll play them together, and you can hear the sort of sound it creates. Yeah, so it's a really simple kick, just constantly on the beat. Nothing too fancy. I wouldn't have that by itself, it just sounds a bit too generic, a bit too robotic. But then with the toms, so that by itself is actually quite a nice sound. Got a bit of sample delay on there as well, only a very small amount, 422, and I don't pan to counteract that, just to have a bit of displacement in the ears. Now if I play them together, it just beefens up a few toms with that orchestral kick, and it also once again keeps the momentum, and that's what I want this track to be. So the brass stabs are very similar to what the last track was, the same with the low stabs. It's just a combination of low brass, low strings, low woodwinds, but it adds to the depth of the brass stab. The one thing I do love about these brass stabs is it's not just the chords that they play, it's the occasional melody line that they have with it, which I love the sound of. So the low stabs don't replicate that, they hold the chords, which is just, it would sound a bit too messy if it was trying to do the melody as well. Sustained strings, just holding the chords but for a sustained amount of time, funnily enough. But it starts off with the modulation being quite low and then rising up, which is the whole sort of theme that runs through this, and quite a lot of the tracks will run through sort of modulation going up, rising into the next sections. It creates a nice flow. Now a different thing I have is the piano. This is doing a weird dissonant kind of sound, but without it it would sound quite empty. So I'll play it by itself. So if you try and listen to that now. So the piano has a lot of replica on it, my form of reverb, but if I was to play it and then take out the piano, then you'd hear the sort of difference. It's just a really good tone that helps to really add to this section and then blasts into the next section. The thing we add into the next part is the staccato strings, which just hold a drone for a little while and then transitions quite nicely. It's just one note. So that goes through the whole second part of that section. Then we break it down to half speed for the next section in this little bit. So quite a simple premise, just using the sort of melody that occasionally runs through this whole track and layering it up with the toms and the orchestral kit doing the exact same rhythm. I literally just copied it onto the orchestral kit and the toms and then just moved it down to the correct MIDI note rather than playing it in again and trying to get the timing right, because I don't believe they're all quantized to the same number. Timpani roll in with that just to help to add, and then we go half speed. Now this was the section that I could not get right. it wasn't this rhythm originally. I was trying many different things, but I couldn't get a rhythm that flowed from that awesome sounding first section, let's say, because I loved the brass stabs. I liked the little melodies that throw in there. Then to try and transition into something else, I couldn't do it, and I didn't at the time have the sort of the breakdown with the staccato strings and the orchestral kit and toms. So it was trying to just come up with some kind of flow, and I actually have an attempt still here because I was thinking about using it. Yeah, it just doesn't sound right. It doesn't flow quite well, and it definitely didn't flow with the last piece. So I had 4 or 5 attempts to try and actually get that section to sound good and continue the track. Because otherwise, I was thinking I don't want to give up on this. I don't want to have to start again, but nothing is working. Anyway, I'll play this section. So as you can hear, there were some ideas there that I kind of like, but it didn't flow right, and I'm happy with what I've got now, definitely, because I could see this being its own track. I could see me manipulating this slightly and editing it and actually creating a whole track out of that, but it didn't work with this momentum in the piece. So I did this section originally by making the drums first. So as you can hear, it's a very sort of simplistic sounding rhythm. If I play it for you now. So, as you can hear, quite simple, but because of that, I was able to just do the brass stabs along with it, and it sounds quite beefy once you add things in. So I've got the cymbal and snare alongside the orchestral kit snare to really add to the punchiness of this section. And that's what I did in the previous track as well. All of this stuff is basically from Metropolis Arc 1 and 3 from Orchestral Tools. The difference in this is the melody is played with the staccato strings rather than the occasional melody and the brass stabs. But overall, I think it sounds great, especially the transition from the previous section. And it slows it down, but keeps the powerful elements going along with it because of these brass stabs, basically, which just have so much power behind them. Now, if I was to play the staccato strings separately, you can hear it sort of following on from that transition from the previous section. It's got a little bit of replica on it as well, and compressed with the default patch, but just turned off the auto gain and turned up the makeup just to add a bit more volume to it without actually adding like a gain plugin, because it adds a little bit of its own colour. Only slightly, but just I'd prefer that to using a full-on just gain plugin. The sustained brass comes into this section, which adds power rather than having sustained strings. I do combine them at some point. Yeah, as you can see here, I've got the strings as well as the brass going. But for this, I thought, let's get rid of the strings. I want the primary strings and the only strings going, the staccato, the melody, but the sustained brass can help to beef up the brass stabs and the low stabs, and yet they're modulated from roughly around 80 to 127, and the next section starts slightly higher just to keep that rise going into the next section. Also brought back the orchestral kit and the future kit just to have that awesome sounding cymbal together, and that goes throughout the whole track as well, just like the last track. Now the next section is just like the introduction section, but includes the orchestral kit and the toms, which also means we've moved on from 4/4 back to 5/4, which transitions quite nicely without anyone sort of paying attention to it. second part of this section is very similar, but I introduced the sustained brass, which is a copy of the sustained strings, but the difference is I actually pitch bend some of it. So as you can see on this chord, I'll pitch bend it slightly down, slightly up. It creates a sort of eerie kind of vibe. Also adds a little bit of interest while this section is playing out. So this brings us on to the next section. As you can see, quite a big MIDI region that I played in. Just going through, it's a slightly different chord progression than previous MIDI regions and previous sections. And you can see I've also removed the talking drum again, but that will come back in for the last section, so I'll play it now. Fairly cool sounding chord progression. What I like about this section is the chord progression. It goes from B to E, which is fairly standard with what I've been doing, kind of sticking around that, but then switches up by going to A, which I hadn't done in the other sections, and therefore it just sounds quite different. And I would say there's some kind of emotion behind it, not necessarily revenge or aggression like there might have been in the stabs and the way that sounds, but sort of a hope. It's got a hope kind of feeling to it, especially as it resolves itself at the end of the section. So I'll play that a little bit again. It resolves itself, and that's quite nice, and then leads into the final section, which is one of my favourite sections out of this track. I've also got a drum roll, which I haven't really mentioned. Just one note modulated from 20 to 127, using the rhythm inbuilt to Metropolis Arc 3, I believe, which is just a snare roll. But yeah, I believe you can do that with the orchestral kit from Logic. You don't need Metropolis Arc 3 to necessarily do that, but it's A0 on the keyboard. You've got a snare roll there, so that would work quite well if you didn't have Metropolis Arc. Alright, so now I'll play the final section, and then I'll discuss it just after. So, the main thing with this is that most sections come back in. I didn't bring in the sustained brass, I tried it, just didn't sound quite right. Wasn't enough to warrant keeping it in. The staccato strings carry the melody, just like some previous sections rather than the brass stab. The main difference with this section is that because of the previous section, this section here, it resolves itself on the B, which means I can't then go into the next section on the B because it just goes on for too long, doesn't sound quite right. So then I had to figure out another chord, and funnily enough, going to E sounded right, and then going down the notes E, D, C, B, which I didn't expect to do, but it sounds great. So I was quite happy with that, because I didn't want to get rid of the resolve in that second to last section, because I like that too. So I had to figure out some way to actually fix that, and that's one of the main things with a lot of this track making stuff is you've got cool ideas, and then you've got another cool idea, or you want to add to that cool idea, but it doesn't quite work out. You shouldn't just give up straight away from that. You should just keep going with it, figure something else out, and then, like I have, you come up with something that's even better, because you can combine two great ideas. Orchestral kit and the toms are doing exactly the same they have been for the previous few sections. Talking drum comes back in for the final time, which I think really adds to this section. I love the talking drum. But the piano comes back in, and that's another main thing. That was only in the second section, so if we hear it now by itself, once again got that dissonant sound, but just adds to this this whole section. And then we've got the staccato strings doing the same sort of melody, maybe a slightly manipulated melody from the previous section, but keeps that theme going. Now the brass trills come back in quite a lot here, rather than just being a transition kind of tool. It's occasionally every few bars, so this just adds to the whole sound once again of this section, because I want the end to be an impactful thing. Unless I'm doing some emotional track where it just sort of fades out, I want this to be the biggest part of it. It's almost like a modulation in a pop song, where it's the last bit, it's the last hurrah. So that's it basically. I know I didn't go into too much detail, but it's very similar to the last track, just the structure slightly different. The time signature change was the sort of important thing in this track, as well as the piano doing a slightly different thing, and the talking drum, which really just adds to the momentum of this piece. I'll probably be doing about 10 tracks to create this album. They won't all sound like this, they won't all be as fast paced or anything like that. There'll be some quieter, more emotional sounding ones with more sustained strings and brass and less stabs, less staccato, just to have some variation obviously in the album, as well as show the difference from emotional impacts I can have with these tracks. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.